For the second year in a row, the number of journalists imprisoned for their work hit a historical high, as the US and other Western powers failed to pressure the world's worst jailers, Turkey, China, and Egypt, into improving the bleak climate for press freedom. A Committee to Protect Journalists special report by Alana Beiser. The number of journalists imprisoned worldwide hit another new record in 2017, and for the second consecutive year more than half of those jailed for their work are behind bars in Turkey, China, and Egypt. The pattern reflects a dismal failure by the international community to address a global crisis in freedom of the press. Far from isolating repressive countries for their authoritarian behavior, the United States, in particular, has cozied up to strongmen such as Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Chinese President Xi Jinping. At the same time, President Donald Trump's nationalistic rhetoric, fixation on Islamic extremism and insistence on labeling critical media fake news serves to reinforce the framework of accusations and legal charges that allow such leaders to preside over the jailing of journalists. Globally, nearly three-quarters of journalists are jailed on anti-state charges, many under broad and vague terror laws, while the number imprisoned on a charge of false news, though modest, rose to a record 21. In its annual prison census, CPJ found 262 journalists behind bars around the world in relation to their work, a new record after a historical high of 259 in 2016. The worst three jailers are responsible for jailing 134, or 51%, of the total. CPJ has been conducting an annual survey of journalists in jail since the early 1990s. Despite releasing some journalists in 2017, Turkey remains the world's worst jailer for the second consecutive year, with 73 journalists behind bars, compared with 81 in 2016. Dozens more still face trial, and fresh arrests take place regularly. In several other cases in Turkey, CPJ was unable to establish a link to journalism. Other press freedom groups using a different methodology have higher numbers. Every journalist CPJ found jailed for their work in Turkey is under investigation for, or charged with, anti-state crimes, as was true of last year's census. The crackdown on the Turkish press that began in early 2016 and accelerated after a failed coup attempt that July, which the government blamed on an alleged terrorist organization led by exiled cleric Fethullah Gulen, continued apace in 2017. Authorities accused some journalists of terrorist activity based solely on their alleged use of a messaging app, Bylock, or bank accounts at allegedly Gulenist institutions. Because Erdogan's ruling AKP party was until recent years aligned with Gulen's movement, the crackdown sometimes led to patently absurd circumstances. For example, prominent journalist Ahmet Teske was acquitted of terrorism charges in April after a 6-year trial in which the defendants said they were victims of police and judicial officials linked to Gulen. Teske remained in jail, however, on fresh terror charges for allegedly being linked to Gulen, and many of the police officers, prosecutors, and judges who brought the original case found themselves accused of terror activity. SK pointed out the contradiction in a lengthy statement to the court in July, saying, "In Turkey, some members of the judiciary have become the gravediggers of justice." Other cases blatantly demonstrated Turkish authorities' brutal censorship tactics. On 31 March, an Istanbul court ordered the release pending trial of at least 19 journalists jailed in the aftermath of the coup attempt, but the prosecutor appealed and the journalists were rearrested before they left the jail. The judges who ordered their release were suspended. Erdogan's government appeared to pay little price for its repressive tactics. In April, he narrowly won a referendum, amid procedural objections by the opposition that went unheeded, that will abolish the country's parliamentary system and grant him sweeping powers. On the international stage, German officials including Chancellor Angela Merkel have repeatedly called for the release of Turkish-German journalist Deniz Yücel, who works for the German newspaper Die Welt and who has been held without charge since February 14. But the NATO allies are bound by Turkey's role in harboring Syrian refugees and other cooperation agreements. Trump, meanwhile, hosted Erdogan at the White House in May and more recently praised him as a friend. Also enjoying global standing as President Xi. In China, the number of journalists behind bars rose to 41 from 38 a year earlier. On a visit to Beijing in November, Trump made no public reference to human rights, despite an ongoing crackdown that has led to the arrests of Chinese journalists, activists, and lawyers. With tensions high between the U.S. and China's neighbor North Korea, and Trump keen to renegotiate the trade balance,